Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I don't know how that's possible, I'm Amy Zsohar, I use she, her pronouns, and this incredibly attractive man is my father, Zsohar. I know. Yeah, that's what 78 looks like in my family. I am good. Seriously. Actually 50 years ago, almost to the day, my dad was driving my grandmother, whom we call Nejmama, which is Hungarian for grandmother, around Kalamazoo, Michigan. They were waiting on the greatest gift from God they were going to receive. My birthday's in 2 days. I'll be 50 in 2 days. And Nejmama started talking about the migration from Budapest to the United States. My dad was 3 when they arrived, so he didn't have really any memories of this. And that started a journey that took about the next 25 years of collecting stories to create the book Surviving Through Faith, which is my family's story of migration from Budapest, Hungary to Waxahachie, Texas. And I am incredibly proud of this story, completely biased, incredibly proud. We do have books available afterwards. I'll sign them for $20, so please grab a copy of the book if you're interested after hearing this incredible story. I'm very proud to say in this moment, my father, Zsohar.
Thank you, Amy. That's the first time I've been introduced by Amy or any of my children, for that matter. So it's wonderful because it was back 50 years ago when I first heard this story, as we were waiting for Amy to be born. And from the very first time, I'm sorry? Excuse me, I don't hear that. But really, from the very first time I heard this story, I knew then that I had to document it and capture it and share it with others, especially my children. Not so much so that I wanted my children to know and understand how the family came to this country, but more so I wanted them to know and understand that through determination, through hope, and especially through faith, that they could deal with any life situations presented before them. You see, that's the message that my mother got from her father when she was a young teenager living in Budapest, Hungary. From time to time in the evening, they'd go and walk after dinner, and they'd talk about various different subjects. One time her father brought up the subject of the Lord's Prayer. He talked specifically about the phrase in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done." He wanted my mother to know and understand that the will of the Lord be done in her life. And he went on to tell her, he says, as you go through day-to-day living, you run into different situations, sometimes difficult situations, you need to remember that the will of the Lord be done. He said this requires faith, and sometimes it requires a tremendous amount of faith. He told mother, said, never lose your faith in the Lord. Never lose your faith. He went on further to say that not only might you run into difficult situations, but you could lose everything. But the one thing you never lose is never lose your faith in the Lord. Now, my mother's wondering, why is he telling me these things? There were a very well-to-do family living in Budapest, Hungary. They had a very nice home on the Buda side of Budapest. Her dad was the president of a teacher's college, made a very good income. They were so well off that they owned a lake house on the resort lake of the Balaton where they would spend their summers. So they were clearly a very well-to-do family. So mother went, why is he telling me these things? Well, fast forward to May of 1943. That's when the Allies began bombing Budapest. These bombings were a result of the German invasion of Hungary and Germans putting in place a Nazi-friendly Hungarian government. And this government began to convert the Hungarian plants and industries into plants and industry that to supporting the Nazi war machine. And these bombings were to destroy those plants and industries. Now, when the bombings began, my parents had been married for about 3 years. My dad had just gotten a doctorate degree in the natural sciences, botany, zoology, and anthropology. He was teaching elementary school during the daytime and working part-time at the university in the evening. Now, my mother, who also had a college degree, was a stay-at-home mom with 2 children, Liz, who was 2 years old, and Julius, who was 9 months old. And each time the air raid sirens went off to warn the bombings were going to begin, they'd have to take the children and the valuable documents to the relative safety of the basement of their home, and when the all-clear sirens sounded, they'd bring the children and the documents back up to their normal living quarters. Now, this happened off and on for the rest of 1943. In the early part of 1944, the bombings began to get far more frequent. Very often now, my dad was not at home when the air raid sirens went off, so mother would have to take the children and the documents to the basement of the home by herself and then bring the children and the documents back up when all-clear sirens were sounded. And this was very difficult for her to do by herself. And also in the early part of 1944, my parents learned that my mother's pregnant with the 3rd child. That's when they decided it would be better for mother and the children to go out to Western Hungary to a place called Kisrakos, where my dad had grown up on a family farm and where Dad's family still lived. It's much safer there than it was in Budapest. But my dad had to stay back in Budapest to do his government job. Next time they saw each other was in August of that year when Mother went from Kisrákos back to Budapest to give birth to the third child, Helen. A few days after Helen was born, she was baptized, and Mother and Helen went back out to Kisrákos, and again, my dad had to stay back in Budapest to do his government job. Now, they weren't sure when they'd be able to see each other again because even though my dad had earned some vacation time, he had to get permission to take that vacation time. He also had to get permission to travel. And wasn't sure he'd be able to do either one, even for Christmas time. So they never promised him anything about when they might see each other again. But fortunately, right before Christmas, my dad was able to get permission to take a few days of vacation and to travel out to Western Hungary to visit his young family. So on December 23rd, he packed his bags and went to the train station in Budapest to catch a train out to Western Hungary. When he got to the train station in Budapest, he found out there was no reliable train transportation at all out to Western Hungary. As a matter of fact, the entire public transportation system was in chaos as a result of the bombings. So he decided to see if he couldn't hitchhike out to Western Hungary. So he was very fortunate. He was able to get several different rides, but they're using the back of open bed trucks, and it was brutally cold in the back of those open bed trucks, and from time to time a truck would break down, so they'd have to repair it along the side of the road. So it took about 24 hours for him to make that 150-mile trip from Budapest to Kisrákos, but he arrived on the family farm on Christmas Eve afternoon. You see, the Hungarians celebrate Christmas Eve, and what a gift it was for the family, for my dad to be there. They knew it's a special blessing that year because so many families could not be together because of the war. The following day, they learned it's more of a blessing than they had originally thought. They were listening to the radio on Christmas morning, and they heard that Russian troops who had invaded Hungary to drive out the Germans had circled Budapest, had in a complete circle. There was fierce fighting going on in Budapest. They had the city sealed off. Nobody could come or go from the city. There was fierce fighting going on in Budapest. But fortunately, because my dad was together with the family, that he wasn't sure now when he'd be able to return back to Budapest, but at least they were together as a family. The following day, my dad became ill. He got an inflammation of the lungs called pleurisy, probably caused by being in the back of those open bed trucks for a long trip from Budapest to Kisrákos. But he became very, very ill. He was so ill, he was bedridden. But that was the good news. The other news was 2 days later, he got a draft notice to join the Hungarian army. You see, the Hungarians were drafting any man who could walk in a futile attempt to slow down the far more powerful Russian troops. But because my dad was ill, he was able to get a letter from the doctor saying he was not fit for military service. What a blessing that was. Well, 6 weeks later, my dad finally became well. By that time, the draft had ended, and he was instructed by the government to go to work in the government office out in Western Hungary. He was working there in late March on a Thursday when a couple of men came to the office where he was working and announced to the workers and the management there that the Russian troops who by now had captured Budapest and were moving toward the west, and as they were moving toward the west, they were committing all types of atrocities on the general Hungarian population. They were abusing the women, they were burning the villages, and they would kill any man that would get in their way. Sounds very familiar to what's happening in Ukraine right now. But the management at my father's office, hearing this, told the workers it was clear that the Hungarian government had collapsed, and they were free to leave their jobs that day and go back and do whatever they needed to do to take care of their families. My dad left his job that day and went back to Kisrákos to the family farm and announced to the family that they were going to flee Hungary that evening ahead of the Russian troops. So they began gathering belongings to take with them and soon realized they didn't have enough containers to put everything in that they wanted to take with them. And there wasn't much lumber stored on the family farm, but there had been some lumber that had been set aside for a coffin for my dad's grandmother. She was still living on the family farm. She was 79 years old. She made it clear that she was not going to be leaving the family farm, and she insisted that my dad take the lumber that had been set aside for her coffin to build some wooden crates. She told my dad she wasn't worried about what was going to happen to her after she died. She'd let somebody else worry about that. Right now, she wanted him to take this lumber that had been set aside for her coffin to build some wooden crates, which my dad did. He quickly built 3 wooden crates, and in those crates they put food, clothing, cooking utensils, blankets, whatever they thought they might need for a long trip without having any idea how long the trip was going to be, and even for sure where they were going. Soon after midnight, they had everything packed and ready to go, but there wasn't any transportation on the family farm to get them into Austria. So they found a farmer nearby who had a horse-drawn wagon who agreed to take him to a village near the border. And there my dad felt for sure that he'd get some kind of transportation there into Austria. So very early that morning, they loaded their belongings on this man's wagon and began that 15-mile journey from Kiesreichers to the border. As they were traveling in the early morning darkness, they could see the glow of the villages burning in the background. They knew the Russian troops were close and knew they needed to get into Austria as quickly as possible. So they arrived that Friday morning at this village near the border, and they unloaded their belongings off this man's wagon. My dad paid the man. He returned to Kiesreichers as they had agreed, and mother and children stayed with their belongings along the side of the road. My dad went into this village to see what kind of transportation he could find into Austria. What he found in the village was chaos and panic. Hundreds and hundreds of other Hungarians heard exactly what my dad had heard about the Russian troops, and they too were trying to flee Hungary into Austria. So my dad spent the better part of that day trying to find any kind of transportation at all, any kind of transportation to get into Austria, and he found nothing at all. So he went back to where mother and children had gathered with their belongings on the side of the road. By that time, other Hungarian families had gathered there as well, and they were all trying to figure out how can we get into Austria. And as they were trying to figure this out, it seemed like from out of nowhere came two men on a wagon pulled by two oxen and approached the area where my parents and other Hungarian families had gathered. And the two men announced to the group that this wagon and oxen belonged to a wealthy count nearby who had a large farm, and the wealthy count knew that the Russians were coming. He didn't want the Russians to benefit from the wagon or the oxen, so he told his workers to take the wagon and the oxen to this village near the border to see if someone could use it for transportation into Austria. Now these oxen were enormous animals with huge horns, very intimidating animals, but my dad wasn't intimidated by them at all because he used to working with those kind of animals on the farm, and we grew up on the farm, so he immediately spoke up and said he would take the oxen in the wagon. The two men gladly gave him the oxen in the wagon, and they quickly left, and now my parents had transportation into Austria. So they put their belongings on this wagon, and there was still some room on the wagon, so they invited another family to join them, and the two families began their journey from that village to the border. Now, it was about a mile from that village to the border. As they were approaching the border, they joined up with 16 other wagons to create a wagon train. You see, not only had the Hungarian government collapsed, but the Austrian government had collapsed as well, and there was all types of criminal activity going on in their area, as you can imagine. And a single wagon by itself was a very easy target for the criminals, but they tended to stay away from large groups of people. So these 17 wagons decided they would travel into Austria as a wagon train for safety reasons. So they crossed the border that Friday evening, which was Good Friday of 1945, into Austria. As they were crossing into Austria, they could look back and see not only the glow of the villages burning in the background, they could actually see the flames of the villages burning, and they could hear the gunfire between the Russian and the German troops. So they knew that the Russians were very close. They knew that they needed to get into Austria as quickly as possible. So they traveled all night that Friday night, all day Saturday, all night Saturday night, stopping only long enough to let the animals rest and feed, and they arrived in Graz, Austria on Easter morning of 1945. Now, because they had traveled fairly quickly into Austria, they felt like they'd put some distance between them and the Russian troops to the extent that they could take a little bit of time and figure out where they should go from there. So they checked around and found to see where they should go, and they found out that Austria had been divided by the Allies into 4 zones. There was the Russian zone, which is where they were, and you knew they didn't want to stay there. There was the French zone and the British zones, which were not too far away, but they were told if they went to the French zone or the British zone, the French troops or the British troops would send them right back to Hungary where they had just come from, and they didn't want that. But they were told if they could reach the American zone, which was much further out toward the west, that the Americans would allow the Hungarians to decide whether they stayed in Austria or returned back to Hungary. So these 17 wagons decided they'd make it their goal to reach the American zone. So they began the journey in a general westerly direction. Now they decided to travel the back roads rather than the main roads because they felt like if they traveled the main roads, they were more likely to run into criminal activity and far more likely to run into Russian troops. But traveling the back roads was much safer, so they decided to travel the back roads. But traveling the back roads was very, very slow. They traveled day after day after day, and the days turned into weeks. And after 3 weeks, they began to run out of food. Now, the food situation was this. When my parents left the family farm, they had a lot of food with them. There was a lot of food that was stored on the family farm, and the grandmother insisted that they take a lot of food with them, which they did. But so many left in such a panic, they took little or no food with them. And those that had food shared with those that did not, until finally, after 3.5 weeks, they were completely out of food, even for the children. That evening, in her evening prayer, Mother prayed to the Lord, said, Lord, we need your help with food, especially for the children. She remembered what her father said, never lose your faith in the Lord, never lose your faith. She said, Lord, it can't be your will for these children to go hungry. Something else for, one thing for adults to be go hungry, but something else for children to go hungry. She said, Lord, please help us, provide us some food for the children. When she finished her prayer, my dad began to recite out loud his favorite Bible verse, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And Mother joined in, and the two of them recited the 23rd Psalm. And once they finished, they were able to relax and go to sleep. The following morning, my dad got up to see if he could find some work for food. Now, my dad spoke very good German, so he could communicate with the local population really well. So he came to a farmhouse, and there he met the farmer's wife. He explained the situation to the farmer's wife, and the farmer's wife explained to my dad that her husband was a prisoner of war, and she was not sure when he'd be released. And so she needed and she had some milk and other food that would be good for the children that she'd share with the Hungarians if they would plow her fields. So my dad agreed, and so he took his oxen and hooked it up to her plow and began to turn over the soil. As the soil turned over, potatoes began popping up out of the ground, one after another after another. The fields had been planted with potatoes, and nobody had told them. So they spent 2 days plowing this farmer's fields and ended up with sacks of potatoes, many of which the farmer's wife shared with the Hungarians, in addition to the food that she had originally promised. Now, what a wonderful answer to prayer that was. Now that they had food, they continued their journey. 10 days later, they crossed the Enns River. They learned two things when they crossed the Enns River. One was that they were now in the American zone. And the second was that the war in Europe had ended. It was May 1945, and the war in Europe had ended. But they didn't know where the Russian troops were, and they didn't trust the Russians at all. So they decided they wouldn't feel safe until they found American occupation forces. So they decided to continue toward the west, looking for the American occupation forces. A week later, they came to a mountain range and decided to cross over that mountain range and then try to go around it. But as they began going up the mountain pass, they realized that much of the mountain pass had been washed out by the heavy winter rain and snow melt, and became very treacherous, very hazardous, very, very physically demanding crossing over this mountain range. And they were exhausted 2.5 days later when they reached the valley on the other side of the mountain range and camped on the banks of the Tron River near the village of Overtron. The following day, they learned that the Americans were only 3 miles away and that they had closed all roads in the area, had halted all travel in the area in order to restore law and order. My parents were relieved because they were exhausted from 7 weeks of travel, and they finally felt safe for the first time because they knew where the Americans were. The following day is May 19th, 1945. That's my sister Liz's 4th birthday. My mother wanted to do something really special for Liz for her 4th birthday, but she didn't have any money. She traded away most of her jewelry for food along the way. But she still had a small gold necklace, and she thought she could just trade a small gold necklace for some bread. She knew how much Liz loved bread. It was something that Liz really loved. It was something that doable, something very practical. So she thought if she could just trade a small gold necklace for some bread, that it'd make a nice gift for Liz. So my mother also spoke very good German as well, so she too could speak with the local population really well. So she went into the village of Obertron to find the bakery. She found the bakery. It was in the baker's home, and the baker answered the door. And my mother explained that she wanted to trade a small gold necklace for some bread for her daughter's 4th birthday. And the baker realized right away she did not have a ration card. He said, without a ration card, he said, I can't sell you any bread. He said, furthermore, I would never take that necklace for bread. That would just not be the right thing to do. He said, but without a ration card, he said, I can't sell you any bread. He said, I can't even give you any bread because he has to account for all the bread that he bakes. So he said, there's just nothing I can do for you. So mother thanked him for his time. She turned, began to walk away. The baker closed the door and almost immediately opened the door back up and begged for mother to come back. He said, wait here. The baker then went into the kitchen where his family had just sat down for breakfast and took the family's ration of bread off the table and brought it and handed it to my mother and said, here, this is a gift. Tell your daughter to have a happy birthday. Mother graciously accepted the gift and went to where they were camped on the banks of the Tron River and gave the bread to Liz, who shared it with her brother Julius. And mother says, you've never seen 2 kids with bigger smiles on their faces than those 2 kids eating that fresh baked bread. Kind of gives you a whole new meaning to the expression of the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. A quick footnote to that story. From that day on, until my mother passed away in 2003, she could not bear to throw bread away. As a matter of fact, she couldn't even bear to see anyone throwing bread away. That's how powerful that event was in her life. She would get so angry if she saw anybody throwing bread away. So now that they know they can't travel, and the roads are closed in the area, that they need to focus on 3 necessities of life: food, clothing, and shelter. So as I just mentioned, without a ration card, food was going to be a problem. So my dad and other Hungarian men learned that one of the few employers in the area was the Austrian Forest Service. And if they went to work for the Austrian Forest Service, they could get paid in cash and be issued ration cards. So my dad and 12 other Hungarian men went to work for the Austrian Forest Service. After 3 weeks later, there's only one of those 13 men still worked for the Austrian Forest Service, and that was my dad. You see, the work was so incredibly physically demanding, so brutally physically demanding, and so incredibly dangerous that all the other men quit and tried to find some other kind of job or live off some kind of a public assistance program that were available in the area. But my dad refused to accept any kind of public assistance. He was determined to provide for his family, and by working for the Austrian Forest Service, he'd get paid cash and be issued ration cards for food. Now, he's also supposed to be issued ration cards for clothing as well. But the local leader there, the local leader of the village, they call him the Burgermeister. The Burgermeister refused to issue my parents ration cards for clothing. He said you had to be an Austrian citizen to get ration cards for clothing. It was a lie, but my parents didn't know. You see, the Burgermeister didn't want the Hungarians to stay there. The villagers had been through a long war, resources were scarce, and he didn't want the villagers to have to share what few resources were available to them with the Hungarians, so he's going to make it as difficult as possible for the Hungarians to stay there, and one of the things he did was refuse to issue a ration card for clothing. But somehow my parents got the clothing that they needed when they needed it. May not have been what they wanted, but it's what they needed when they needed it, especially shoes, because they walked a lot and they wore out the soles of their shoes. So the other necessity of life is shelter. Now, when my dad was there in the summer of 1945, working up in the mountains, cutting trees and hauling them to the sawmills, Mother was trying to find a place for them to live. They were still banked on the camps on the banks of the Tron River, and they knew they couldn't stay camped there for the brutally cold Austrian winters, so they needed to find some kind of a shelter, some kind of house, a home to live in. So Mother would see a house for rent. She'd go check on it. She'd be told, I'm sorry, it's no longer for rent. And then she'd find a couple of rooms for rent and be told, I'm sorry, it's just been rented. And this happened over and over and over that summer of 1945. And finally, in the late summer, she met one of the local ladies and became very acquainted with her. And the local lady confided to my mother and says, the Burgermeister told the villagers not to rent to the Hungarians. And if they did, there were serious consequences for it. So nobody would rent to my family, but they were still camped on the banks of the Tron River and needed to find some kind of shelter to make it through the cold Austrian winter. But in the meantime, Mother had noticed while she was walking around looking for a place to rent that there was a small stone building at the base of the mountain nearby. It was about 14 feet, about 16 feet, a very small one-room stone building that nobody had been around all summer long. So she decided to see what the story was about this small building, and found out that it was, in fact, an abandoned building, and it had been condemned as not suitable for human habitation. But she also learned that there were no laws in Austria against occupying abandoned buildings. So they decided they'd see if they couldn't just fix up this abandoned building as a temporary shelter just to make it through the winter, with the idea they'd go back to Hungary in the spring. So with the help of some kind neighbors, they were able to put a door in the door opening, put windows in the window openings. They had wood-burning stove for heat and for cooking, but they had no electricity and no running water. But the 5 of them moved into a small stone building just to make it through the winter, with the idea that by the time spring came, they'd go back to Hungary. When the spring came, they began to get letters from home, and the news was not good. The Russians, who had invaded Hungary to drive out the Germans, had decided to stay in Hungary, and they were imposing communism on the general Hungarian population and were requiring government workers to pledge allegiance to communism. If you did not pledge allegiance to communism, you were beaten and thrown in jail or worse. And the family back in Hungary knew that my dad was a government worker and knew he would never pledge allegiance to communism. So they, in their letters, they emphasized, choose safety, choose where you are over coming home. Choose safety, choose where you are over coming home. This was devastating news for my parents, because now they had to completely admit to themselves they were refugees, they were displaced persons. They were like millions of other people in Europe who had been displaced by the war. And they also knew it may be a while before they could find a country that would take them. You see, countries that were taking immigrants were first taking their soldiers back from war and putting them into a peacetime domestic economy. And what few jobs were left over after that were usually low-paying jobs, which would support maybe a single person or a couple, or at the most a couple with one child. So they knew it may be a while before they would find a country that would take them, but they were determined to keep looking for that country. They always had hope that some country would change their immigration laws to accept them, and they always had faith that they would somehow find a new home. So they decided to let's just try to make it through another season a year, just like they made it through the winter into the spring. Let's just make it from the spring into the summertime. Certainly by summertime, somebody will take us. Nothing. But then the following fall, nothing. That was in 1946. The fall of 1946, still nothing. The following winter, still nothing. Nobody would accept them. And then spring of 1947, still nothing. But something did happen in the spring of 1947. I was born. I won't go into details around the circumstances of my birth except to say two things. One is, as you can imagine, I was an unplanned child. And the second thing is there was a young Austrian doctor whose misdiagnosis contributed to the fact that I was an unplanned child. But I was born in May of 1947 in the closest hospital to Obertraum, which was in Bad Ischl, Austria, which was about a 20-minute train ride from Obertraum. And then when we got out of the hospital, now there's 6 of us in this small stone building, still just waiting for a place to call home, still just trying to find a country that would take them. So they thought, well, sure, certainly by the summer of 1947, something will open up. Still nothing. The following fall of 47, still nothing. The following winter, still nothing. The spring of 1948, still nothing. The summer of 1948, still nothing. Finally, in the fall of 1948, they got some wonderful news. They learned that Australia had changed its immigration laws, and the occupation had a household was not an issue, but the size of the family was. They wanted to limit the size of the family to a family of 6. So my parents thought, well, maybe we can immigrate to Australia. So they sent off the application and received the application in the mail and all the forms they needed to fill out. And they carefully were filling out all the applications in the form. And just when they were ready to turn everything in, my parents learned that my mother was pregnant with the 5th child. That disqualified them from going to Australia. They were devastated, as you can imagine, especially my mother. She decided to blame herself for the pregnancy. This time she couldn't blame it on the misdiagnosis of an Austrian doctor. She blamed it totally on herself, and she was very upset about having this 5th child. They were already very, very crowded in this tiny, small, one-room house, and they didn't need another child. She was very distraught, very upset about that entire winter. And just when she thought things couldn't get worse, they did. On March 8th, 1949, my sister Helen, who was 4.5 years old, became ill. So they put her in the hospital in Bad Ischl to run tests, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. So they ran tests day after day after day. Now, my dad had to take off from work to be with my mother in the hospital because as soon as Helen got sick and went to the hospital, the other 3 children came down with whooping cough. So she had 3 children in a small stone building with whooping cough, and one in the hospital with a disease they didn't know what it was. What they did determine was that Helen had an extremely low red blood cell count, dangerously low red blood cell count, but they couldn't figure out what was attacking the red blood cells, so they continued to run tests day after day after day. Finally, after several days, Mother was able to have an opportunity to go visit Helen in the hospital. So she's visiting with Helen in the hospital when 2 doctors came in and started talking about the diagnosis of the low red blood cell count. And the younger of the 2 doctors suggested, well, maybe we should do a blood transfusion. Maybe that would help us. Maybe this may be some kind of blood disease. Well, the older of the 2 doctors says, well, it'd be experimental at best, and to have any chance of success, it'd have to be an exact blood match to Helen's blood type. And so they checked around and found out the only person that had an exact blood match to Helen's blood type was my mother, and she was 8 months pregnant. And this is when the older doctor says, under no circumstances would he ever approve a blood transfusion from a woman who's 8 months pregnant. It's too dangerous for the mother and too dangerous for the child. The younger of the 2 doctors insisted, well, this may be the only thing that can save Helen's life. And so they got into a heated argument back and forth about this blood transfusion. And finally, the older doctor vehemently said, under no circumstances would he ever agree to a blood transfusion from a woman who's 8 months pregnant. He doesn't want to talk about it. End of the discussion. That's it. Forget about it. So this is all happening right in front of my mother. And now she's even feeling even worse about the pregnancy that she had. Now she's thinking the pregnancy she's got is keeping Helen from getting the kind of treatment that may save her life. So she leaves the hospital that day very, very upset, even more upset than before. And it's about a 10-minute walk from the hospital to the train station. As she's walking toward the train station, she stopped at a very busy intersection to wait for the traffic to clear. She doesn't pay much attention when a little girl around 10 or 11 years old reaches up and grabs her hand. And so she's so deep in thought about everything going on in her life, she's just not paying much attention to this little girl at all. Finally, the traffic clears, and she walks across this road, and the little girl tightly holds onto her hand until they get to the other side. Once they got to the other side, the little girl let go and scampered off. Mother thought that little girl just needed somebody to get her across this dangerous road, and trusted my mother, a person she didn't know, to get her to the other side. She didn't think much about it after that at all. Following day, late in the evening, there's a knock at the door. It's a man from across the street. He's one of the few people in the area who has a telephone, and he doesn't mind villagers using his telephone in case of an emergency. He told my mother that my dad was calling from the hospital and needed to talk to my mother right away. So mother goes to this man's house and begins to talk to my dad. My dad explained to my mother that Helen had taken a turn for the worse. She's unconscious, she's in a coma, and the doctors think she's going to die that night. And that he knew that the last train had already run that evening, so he wanted mother to take the first train out the next morning and bring with her a dress to bury Helen in and her favorite toy, a doll. And then he went on further to say that if Helen lives through the night, he's going to stay by her side because he doesn't want her to die without a family member by her side. But if she dies during the night, he will meet my mother at the train station in Bad Ischl. So mother agreed. She went back to this temporary shelter where the kids were coughing all around, and she began to think about Helen dying. As she thought about Helen dying, she began to realize how much she loved children. And as she thought about how much she loved children, all of a sudden she had a different view about this pregnancy. Then she began to think what a blessing it was to be pregnant at that time. And then she began to feel terrible about all the negative thoughts she'd had about this unborn child, all the negative things she said about this unborn child, and she just felt awful about everything that she'd said about this child. So she decided to pray to the Lord, said, Lord, please forgive me for everything I've said about this child, for everything, all my thoughts, negative thoughts about this child. But Lord, you know how much I love children. You know how much I really love children. So Lord, please forgive me. Then she went on, she said, but Lord, why is all this happening to me? Why? And she was thinking about that. She thought about what her father said, never lose your faith in the Lord. Never lose your faith in the Lord. Mother's wondering, how can I deal with this? And then somehow that thought about that child from the day before, how that child had trusted my mother, a person she didn't know, to get her across this dangerous road to the other side of the road. She said, why can't I have the faith of a child and trust the Lord, somebody that she knows, to get her through this crisis in her life? And she thought that's the only thing she could do, just like her father said, trust the Lord to do his will. Trust the Lord to do his will. And then she said, well, I'll put it in the hands of the Lord. She said, Lord, I'm putting it in your hands. Whatever your will is for me, that's what I'll accept. And once she put everything in the hands of the Lord, she said she had a peace and tranquility that came over her, such that she was able to go to sleep, even with the children coughing all around her. The following morning, she got up and took the dress she was instructed to do and the doll, and the train from Obertron to Bad Ischl. It was a 20-minute train ride. And when the train starts approaching the platform there in Bad Ischl, there's my dad on the platform. She knew what that meant. That meant that Helen had died during the night. So mother was distraught and very upset, as any mother would be, knowing she just lost a child when she gets off the train. My dad runs up to her and says, hurry, we need to get to the hospital quickly. And my mother's thinking, wait a minute, if Helen's dead, why do we need to get to the hospital quickly? And furthermore, she's 8 months pregnant. She can't run. So she said, what's going on? And my dad realized he needed to explain to my mother that Helen was indeed still alive, and that somehow that night, in the middle of the night, this doctor who so vehemently had opposed the blood transfusion had a change of mind and a change of heart, and he agreed to the blood transfusion. My dad was so excited about the possibility of this helping Helen that he ran from the hospital to the train station to get mother back to the hospital as quickly as possible. So when they get to the hospital, the nurses already had a cot down beside Helen's bed, and mother laid down on the cot, and they did a direct arm-to-arm blood transfusion from my mother's arm into Helen's arm. A few minutes after they finished the blood transfusion, Helen opened up her eyes and said in Hungarian, "Édesanyja," which in English means, "Dear Mother." The doctors were cautiously optimistic about this outcome to the extent that they agreed to do a second blood transfusion the following day. So the following day, my mother went back to the hospital, and this time Helen was awake and alert, and she didn't want anybody sticking any needles in her arm. So she fought the doctors and the nurses to the extent that they couldn't find a vein to put the needle in. So they had to do what they call a cut-down procedure. They actually cut open her arm in order to find a vein to put the needle in for the second blood transfusion. A little while after the second blood transfusion was finished, quite a while after it finished, Helen stopped breathing, and the doctor was ready to declare her dead. And my dad says, no, we're going to do CPR on her. We're going to do CPR. He's not going to accept her. She's dead. So he starts pressing on her chest, says, breathe like this. And she'd take a couple of breaths and then stop. He'd start again, pressing on her chest, breathe like this. And she'd take a couple more breaths. Next time, maybe 3 breaths or 4 breaths. It seemed like he did this for hours before she finally began to breathe on her own and showed real signs of improvement. A nurse who had witnessed this later told my dad that what she had witnessed was a father giving life to a child for the second time. After that, Helen began to improve day after day. And 2 weeks later, mother went back to the hospital and gave birth to the 5th child, Julia. 10 days after Julia was born, mother, Julia, and Helen, all 3 went home from the hospital the very same day. Now, a couple quick notes to that story. They never did know, and still don't know, what disease Helen had. What they do know is that other children in the area had the same symptoms, all of which died, even those that had blood transfusion, leading most to believe there must be something in the blood of a pregnant woman that was able to attack whatever was attacking Helen's red blood cells to the extent that she was able to survive and none of the other children were. Therefore, it was likely that the pregnancy my mother did not want saved Helen's life. The second footnote to that story, from the time Helen left the hospital, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. Helen got a master's degree in nursing, a doctorate in education, and taught nursing for 29 years at the University of Utah. Retired 6 years ago as a professor emeritus from the University of Utah. She still lives in Sandy, Utah. She was in Dallas for a family reunion last month in May, Mother's Day weekend. And by the way, she still carries that scar on her arm where they did a cut-down procedure. And she'll be 81 in August. So she knew what she wanted to do and did it well. But now there's 7 of us in this small stone building. Still no place to call home. Still just trying to make it through another season a year. Let's just make it through the summer of 49. Certain something will open up. Still nothing. The fall of 1949, still nothing. Finally, in January of 1950, the family got a letter from Church World Services. Church World Services said that the United States immigration laws had changed. The size of the family is not an issue, but the occupation of the head of the household is. They wanted only unskilled or semi-skilled workers. Now, my dad had grown up on a farm, so he decided to see if he couldn't come to the United States as a farm worker, which was one of the quotas that they were looking for. So he goes to Linz, Austria to meet with the American officer. And he tells the American officer that he wants to come to the United States as a farm worker. So he presents his papers to the American officer, and the American officer looks at the papers and says, sure, Dr. Zsohar, you're a farm worker. Yeah, you got a doctorate degree to be a farm worker. And he had to convince the American officer that he knew farming techniques, he knew how to operate farming equipment, knew how to maintain farming equipment. And he went on to convince the American officer that he could also be a forest worker because he had worked in the forest for the past 5 years. Now, the American officer took a real liking to my dad. And he said, look, he says, it's very clear to me that you're qualified to come to the United States as a farm worker or as a forest worker. He said, I won't put you on a quota for forest worker because it pays more. But he said, let me tell you something. He says, when you get to the United States, you don't have to do any of the jobs that are on that quota system. You don't have to be a farmer. You don't have to be a forest worker. You can do any job you want to do. We just need to get you and your family to the United States. My dad was thrilled to learn that they qualified to come to the United States. So he went back to Overtron to wait word from Church World Services making the travel arrangements. 2 weeks later, they heard from Church World Services that travel arrangements had been made. And this time, with great excitement and great anticipation, they packed those same wooden crates that they'd fled Hungary with to begin their journey to the United States. They left Overtron and went to Linz, Austria for 2 days. And then from Linz, Austria, they went to Salzburg for a week of orientation. And from Salzburg, they went to Bremerhaven, Germany to catch a transport to the United States. On February 18th, 1950, they boarded the General A.W. Greeley for a trip across the Atlantic Ocean. They arrived in New York on March 3rd, 1950. Now, this was no ordinary crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. The New York Times wrote an article about this ship's crossing over the Atlantic Ocean. I have a copy of that article here. I'll get it out for you. Let me read you a little bit about what the New York Times said about this ship's journey across the Atlantic Ocean. The article is dated March 4th, the day after the ship arrived in New York. The headline reads, "Transport Docks After Rough Trip." The Navy Transport General A.W. Greeley arrived here yesterday from Bremerhaven, Germany, with 1,301 displaced persons. The vessel was 3 days behind schedule after a voyage that included a slight collision, a storm, and being hit by a bolt of lightning. On February the 19th, in a dense fog in the Straits of Dover, the Greeley collided with another transport ship. Only the seamanship of Greeley's master averted what might have been a serious crash. The damage to the Greeley was minor, and the ship continued its journey. 10 days out, while the ship was rolling in a heavy swell, she was struck suddenly by a tornado-like gust that came up without warning. All passengers were ordered off the deck, and while the order was being carried out, a blinding flash of lightning struck the bow of the ship and traveled the entire length of the 496-foot transport. Luckily, no one was hurt by the electrical charge. You see, my parents knew they'd been on a rough trip across the Atlantic, but what they didn't know, the day before the ship arrived, the Thursday before the ship arrived on Friday, Church World Service was notified by the local sponsor that they had to withdraw sponsorship of the family. See, the original destination was a place called New Windsor, Maryland. And there was a measles epidemic in New Windsor, Maryland, and it was quarantined. Nobody could go in or out of the city. So the local sponsor from New Windsor, Maryland had notified Church World Services that they could no longer sponsor the family. But Church World Services still needed to find a local sponsor. So they looked over their list of potential local sponsors, and on that list they saw where Central Presbyterian Church in Waxahachie, Texas had made an inquiry about sponsoring a family in the summer of 1950 to pick cotton in Waxahachie. So Mr. Anderson with Church World Services decided he'd call the church in Waxahachie to see if they'd be willing to take a family early. So he calls the church, and Reverend Don Swain answered the phone, and he asked Reverend Don Swain if they were willing to take a family early. Reverend Swain said, well, as you can imagine, all of these Presbyterians here, that a pastor cannot make that decision. The ruling elders, the session has to make that decision. And he would call an emergency meeting of the session that Thursday night, and would get back to Mr. Anderson the following day. Well, the session met that Thursday night, and they agreed to take a small family. The following day, Reverend Swain calls Mr. Anderson and says, our session met last night, and we agreed to take a family, but we would prefer a family with few children. Mr. Anderson thought, he said, 5 children? We got just exactly what your church would prefer. And when they started making travel arrangements, they realized there had been a misunderstanding. But Reverend Swain said, tell the family we'll take them anyway. Tell them to come on. So this was all decided about noon that Friday. So as the family's getting off the ship in Manhattan, they learned that their new destination is a place called Waxahachie, Texas. So the Church World Services takes the family to Grand Central Station where they're waiting for a train to Texas. While they're waiting there, a Hungarian man who recognized the family from being on the ship comes up to him and says, where in the United States are you going? He says, they said, well, we're going to someplace in Texas. We can't pronounce the name, but it's someplace in Texas. And he says, Texas? That's the worst place in the United States. It's hot, it's flat, there are no trees there. You're going to hate it in Texas. And just when my parents were so excited about their new destination, I wondered, now what are we getting ourselves into? Nonetheless, they boarded the train that Friday evening, traveled all night, Friday night, all day Saturday, all night Saturday night, and arrived in Dallas on Sunday morning around 8 a.m. They get off the train and waiting there on the platform when they notice 5 couples coming toward them. They thought, well, these must be the people from the church because they were immaculately dressed in an absolute Sunday best. And those 5 couples saw 7 of the most bedraggled-looking dressed people that they ever saw. And they said, that must be a refugee family because of the way they're dressed. But the church members there embraced the family like my parents never expected. They knew immediately this is where they belong. They divided the family up into various cars and drove 35 miles from Dallas down to Waxahachie. And as the car that my parents were in were pulling in front of this big white house, my parents thought, this can't be the house. It's far larger than they ever imagined. but it was the house. They were even more surprised when they went inside. It was totally furnished. There was dining room furniture, stove in the kitchen, icebox, food in the pantry, linen, bedroom furniture, living room furniture, toys for the children. They went as far as to put fresh cut spring flowers for a family that didn't even know coming 2 days earlier. They did this for a family that didn't even know coming 2 days earlier. In essentially a day and a half, they were able to find a house, rent it, scrub it from top to bottom, and totally furnish it. They did this for a family that didn't even know. They did this for a family that didn't even know. That morning, at the Sunday morning worship service at Central Presbyterian Church, 11 o'clock worship service, Ed Clark, who had led this effort, stood before the congregation and told them of the events of the past 2 days. Told them about how they had come together, what all they had done to get the house ready, how they had furnished it, and he went on further to say that the family has arrived and they're safely in the house. And then at the conclusion of his remarks, he said, "Today we became a church." The following morning, my mother, afraid to open up her eyes. The day before had been so perfect, it had to have been a dream, but it wasn't. It was reality. It was a reality that was brought about by their determination, their hope, and especially their faith, that they were able to survive the condition that they lived under there in Austria and have the opportunity to come to this great country, the United States of America, have the opportunity to be a part of the great state of Texas, to be a part of the wonderful community of Waxahachie, and finally, after 5 years, to have a place that they can now call home. Thanks be to God.
He's open for questions. I think he knew that was coming. So y'all have any questions? Yeah.
So
I was 2.5 when we came, so I grew up speaking Texan.
Rod asked if that was a Hungarian accent.
No, it's interesting that my parents, as we were growing up, insisted that we learn the Hungarian language, but we were the only Hungarian family in Waxahachie, and when you're the only Hungarian family, you're not speaking to anybody but your parents that are Hungarian, and so the rule was when you were in a house, you had to speak Hungarian, so we didn't talk very much in the house. So it was especially when my dad was around.
Your mom did that on purpose.
You shared about your grandmother, the grandmother who insisted that the wood that was saved for her coffin be used for the crates. Is anything known about what the nature of that grandmother's life was after your father and mother left?
Well, she was the last person there. The other family, and my dad's brother left the same day he did, and all the other family had already left, so she was there by herself, and as far as everybody knows, she just passed away living by herself on the farm there. She was quite a woman, by the way. She was a strong-willed person, unlike some others of us.
Did the crates make it to Texas?
Oh, yes, they did. Matter of fact, I'm glad you asked. I have one of the crates at my house, and one of them's at my sister's house, my older sister's house, and one's at my older brother's house. So each of us have, the three of us have, each have a crate. It's cool because it's still has the name, my dad's name on it, and the destination Waxahachie, Texas, with the sticker that said General A.W. Greeley on the crate. The other thing I want to mention about the crates, these are wooden crates. When it's empty, it takes all of everything I've got to lift that crate. When it's empty, I can't even imagine when it's full of food and all the other stuff you put in these crates, because one of the crates is really quite large. I've got one of the smaller ones. My brother has the largest one. I've got one of the smaller ones. There's two smaller ones and one large one. So I've got the one of them. And I occasionally, if depending on where I do my presentation, I'll even take the crate with me, And also I have the saws that he used when he was working up in the mountains. And I usually take those to presentations, but they wouldn't appreciate that much on an airline coming with a saw that's that long, you know. So, but I do have the saws. That means a lot to me, see those saws, because that tells me what he went through, you know, what he did. And not just my dad, my mother, she had to do a lot to keep. Think about this for a second, living 5 years without electricity and without running water. So you had no indoor restroom for 5 years in those kind of conditions, living in a cold winter when the trough that they would normally take water from would freeze up. So mother would have to go down to a brook that was still with running water to do laundry, to do whatever needed to be done. It overwhelms me to think about the hardships that they lived under there. I don't know how they did it. And with all the children there, it's an amazing story. And that's really so powerful to me to be able to capture that story and share it, because it's a powerful story about what they went through.
Is the stone house in Austria still there? Have you gone back to see it ever, or have you gone back to Budapest or seen any of those places?
The stone building that we lived in 5 years was torn down. It was as I said before, it was really an abandoned building, and it got torn down. The only reason I know the size of it is when I went back to Obertron when I was working on the book. I went to see, my mother was with me, and I says, tell me where this stone building was. And I was able to dig through the grass and found the foundation of it. So I was able to measure the size of it. And that's the way I knew what the size was for sure. Now, in Budapest, the house that my parents were living in there actually did get bombed at one point. And there's a lot in the book that I'm not talking about. There it talks a lot about those things there, but they were afraid to fix it up, because if they fixed it up, the Russian troops would take it over. The Russians would take it over, and so the Russians took the nicer homes, and so if they didn't want a home that had destruction, some structure issues with it. So one kind of interesting thing. Back in 2009, my sister Liz, who taught school for the Department of Defense, they had a reunion in Las Vegas where all the teachers that had taught overseas would meet to reacquaint themselves with their other teachers that had taught overseas. And she was there, and they have this, tables assigned to different people, so that if you're looking for somebody that you taught with, and let's say in Germany, they'd be sitting at table 9. And things like that. So this man walks up to the table where my sister was sitting and says, there's a Hungarian woman at this table, I know. And my sister Liz says, well, that must be me. And so he says, well, when did you leave Hungary? And she says, March 30th, 1945. And he says, so did I. He says, where'd you end up? She says, Obertron, Austria. He says, so did I. It turns out that man was the son of the leader of the wagon train. I told you they had a wagon train. And he was a 16-year-old son of the wagon train leader. And it's mentioned in the book. My mother had remembered him, and it's mentioned in the book. And she met him, and I got his contact information. And it so happened that we were going to be traveling through the West Coast that summer. And so we went up to Spokane, Washington, where he's living, and met the man and visited with him quite some time that day. So it's kind of amazing how those things kind of happen, you know, out of nowhere, they made that connection there. This good Presbyterian story here. Finally, when my mother learned to speak English, she was there in Waxahachie. She was all the neighbors around us were Baptist, and so she was visiting with these Baptist women, and they were talking about what happened that weekend of March 3rd and 4th and 5th. And the Baptist women were saying, all of a sudden, all these cars started coming down East Marvin Street. We'd never seen that much traffic coming down East Marvin. And all these people gathering, working on this house and everything. We were saying, wow, that is amazing. And then they said, well, then they found out they were Presbyterians. They really couldn't believe it then. The cover?
The cover of the book.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't even see it was up there.
Yeah.
The picture with my mother, and that's my brother, Julius, that my dad's holding, and that's my sister Liz. That was taken in May of 1943. Remember I started talking about the bombings in May of 1943. That was taken in May of 1943. And the church is Central Presbyterian Church in Waxahachie, Texas. So the symbolism here is my parents, the beginning of the story, and where they were destined to end up, which was Central Presbyterian Church. Mother clearly believed that this was God's will that they be at this church. And the church was I can't even begin to tell you how wonderful that church was for the family. I mean, what I described earlier about furnishing it was just part of it. They embraced the family in a big way. And it was the first immigrant family that they had in Waxahachie, I think, for many, many years. But it was, but that's the symbolism. I want, and by the way, that picture that you see of the church, that's my dad's artwork. He drew that.
Oh, wow.
And my dad was an artist, and he that's how he made a living here in the United States as an artist and art teacher. So we have pencil sketches of the church. We have, you probably not familiar with Waxahachie, but they have one of the most famous courthouses in the state of Texas. And he's got a picture of the courthouse. And he also has, on the back cover of the book, is a picture of the house, a pencil sketch of the house that my dad did, pencil sketch of the house as well, that I used for the back cover of the book.
He said courthouse. I have to translate Texas sometimes. That was court. Courthouse, in case you heard a different word. So let's thank Z for his time. I'm sure he'll stick around to say more.
Thank you.
But thank you.
My pleasure.